Articles, petition articles are being brought by Mr. Moss, who's here this evening to make a presentation.
Mr. Moss, please introduce yourself. Welcome. Thank you, Mr. Holland.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Bryan Moss. I live at 16 Ruthin Circle, and I'm here to talk about warrant articles 13 and 14. The first one being 13, which is the support of fossil fuel divestment. So fossil fuel divestment is happening all around us as far as a campaign. It's worldwide, it's statewide, it's local, town levels, university levels. So as a concerned parent, I wanted to bring it to our town because fossil fuel divestment is a moral issue, a political issue, and a financial issue. It's a moral issue because we have a responsibility to have a livable planet for future generations. So as a concerned parent, I wanted to make sure we brought that forward and discuss it as a town. It's a political issue because there's a lot of influence from the fossil fuel industry politically, and I think as citizens and students and others, we are looking for ways to weigh in on this issue of climate change and how the fossil fuel companies may be dealing with it. It's also a financial issue because we are not only funding fossil fuel companies and their business practices, but with that, we're funding climate change. So as we continue to fund fossil fuel companies and those practices, we're actually profiting from climate change. One of the things that is risky about fossil fuel, and just to take a step back, divestment is not about bankrupting or really hurting fossil fuel companies financially, because really divestment can't do that very well, because if you look at the state pension, you may have maybe 2.6% of it was a figure I saw from the year 2013 that are invested in fossil fuels. So it's actually a small amount of the entire pension fund is invested in fossil fuels. So it's not enough to bankrupt fossil fuel companies, and that's not the goal of divestment, right? The goal of divestment is to steer them towards more sustainable practices. And why they need to be steered is because of it's kind of funny how they call it the science behind it is been put forward by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN-sponsored body for the scientific research. And what they've come out with just recently, this past year, is the carbon budget. So I thought it was funny that they used terms and related it to that. But the carbon budget, they have said, this is how much carbon that we can put into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, we've already used half of the carbon budget. So according to the science, we've used approximately half of the carbon budget, so we have half to go. Of course, our rate is going at a very rapid pace and not declining. So the fossil fuel companies have in reserve today more fossil fuels than we can burn to stay safely under the 2-degree Celsius change in temperature that would ensure us to stay within a safer level of climate change. As soon as we go above and burn more than our carbon budget, we go above the 2 degrees Celsius and start to get into more catastrophic consequences of climate change. So because they have many times the reserves that they can burn, that puts some financial risk in what we call the carbon bubble, where these fossil fuel companies now own reserves that potentially, once different governmental bodies start to control the amount of carbon that could be emitted in the atmosphere, that those fossil fuel reserves would become stranded and unburnable, which would be bad for the economy, for those companies, for the economy, for us. So I think this divestment is a way to, help transition, another way to help transition, because they intend fully to continue to burn those fossil fuel reserves, and one reason we know that is because they are actually still out seeking more reserves and to drill for more. So I think they spend about $700 billion was the last figure yearly to find more reserves. And if they already are exceeding a carbon budget, then finding more is only going to exacerbate the problem. So kind of went from a more local to a global sense there. But I think locally what we can do is make a statement from the local level saying that, we have loved ones, kids, we're concerned, we want to work together and shift this. So one of the ways we can do that is through divestment. Usually the town will have not that high of level of fossil fuels. So Shrewsbury probably on its own doesn't, but that would be one thing in this article that we'd want to do is to find out how much fossil fuels investments we have. And when I mentioned, I should clarify, because this is definitely a delineation by fossil fuel company. I don't mean every fossil fuel company. We mean the top 200, 100 coal and 100 oil and gas companies by reserve, if they were burned, the amount of carbon they would put into the atmosphere. So you're really talking about the top 100 of both of those sections. So not the, companies, down the street or local companies that wouldn't be affected by that. It would be actually just singling out those like Exxon and BP and the bigger ones. So if we look at, we would want to identify how much Shrewsbury has in fossil fuels, and then potentially decide to divest from that. Usually you're going to have between 1 and less than 10%. So maybe talking around an average like 5% maybe in fossil fuels. And you see the state pension also has less than 3% in fossil fuels. So that is the proposal that my article has, and be happy to take any questions if you had any.
Much of our investments are passive investments invested in, say, the Diamond Exchange Traded Fund, which is the Dow Industrial Average. Contained in those 30 stocks are ExxonMobil, Texaco, Chevron, the Southern Company. I would be very leery of throwing out our passive investment plan
Yep.
For this. And I don't understand, if everyone were to divest from Exxon and drive that price down to $4 a share, and only unscrupulous, immoral people like me are buying it at $4 a share, how does that affect, when someone pulls up to the pump, how much gas they're going to buy? How does that affect demand? Can this possibly, even if you are wildly successful, can this possibly affect the consumption of fossil fuels in this house, in this country? I don't see the old lady sitting in her house saying, I'm going to turn the heat down to 62 because Exxon's share price went down 3% yesterday. I really find this somewhat ridiculous.
Yep. No, that's a valid case. As far as I do have an example that might help, because I thought this was a really good example. The Rockefeller Fund. So in September 2014, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which controls about $860 million in assets, joined the campaign that in total right now there's $50 billion that the campaign has. They have $160 million. So the ones that started ExxonMobil were the Rockefellers, and that family is still on the board. So I have a couple of quotes from them. He's not, but Stephen Heinz, the president of Rockefeller Brothers Fund, said, John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, which became Exxon, moved America out of whale oil and into petroleum. Probably sounds strange these days to talk about whale oil. We are quite convinced that if he were alive today, as an astute businessman looking out to the future, he would be moving out of fossil fuels and investing in clean, renewable energy. And Valerie Rockefeller Wayne, who was a descendant, is the chair of that fund. And they're in the process right now of divesting, so it's over time. So this isn't like day one, everybody's out. I mean, this is a process where people are joining the campaign.
I'm still not seeing how this reduces fuel consumption.
Yep. So she says, first we pulled out of coal and tar sands. So they're pulling out of the worst first. Coal is, what they say, the most carbon intensive.
Where we get 2/3 of the electricity from in our country.
Correct. I'll get to, maybe this is a long way to your answer, but we're down to less than 1% of our endowment in that and less than 5% in all fossil fuels. And we are looking really hard on how we can further reduce that, both to redirect the money into clean energy or other types of investments. So it's one way to take that, 3% that are going into these companies and moving them into cleaner energies to help address, because remember, this intergovernmental panel on climate change has set the budget for us. So from a financial point of view, when you have a budget, it's really working within that budget. So there are a lot of different strategies, and the IPCC will give you different strategies, saying you need to have mitigation, you got to work on agriculture and energy, and it's really going to take an all-out effort in all these different areas. And some people may not agree with divestment. They might say, I just want to invest in renewables and not take the divestment route. But this is one way that if we feel that really, if the carbon budget is what it is, we don't have much time as far as using up that carbon budget. If we don't reduce the rate that we're doing, then we probably have about 30 years before that carbon budget's used up. So it really is kind of a wake-up call for me to see some of these figures coming out of the IPCC.
Mr. Segal.
Well, I mean, I kind of take the same route. Number one, the people investing the money for us, I think, are much better at it than I am.
Yep.
So I think far be it for me to tell them how I should invest the town's retirement money, number one. Number two, the best way I can help things out is I don't have air conditioning in my house. I mean, if anybody has air conditioning, they shouldn't be voting in favor of this, because an air conditioner is probably one of the biggest electrical users around. It's one of the biggest hogs. Your bill goes up 30-40% in the summer for air conditioning.
Yep.
So let's all turn off our air conditioners. I mean, that's the fastest way to get home. I have another problem with all the environmentalists. You look at the Cape Winds project. That thing should have been installed 5 years ago, but all the environmentalists were the ones, they're the ones crying, let's get renewable energy, but then they're the ones against installing it. And I can cite you dozens of situations all across the country whereby they have fought the installation of renewable energy.
Yep.
Huge facilities. In the Mojave Desert, they wanted to put up enough solar panels to light up the city of Los Angeles. They got shot down by environmentalists. I mean, it's a contradiction, because to say we don't want to invest in ExxonMobil, I think we're going to have a tough enough time hitting our goal to become fully funded without doing things like this. There might be other companies to invest in, but if we start to narrow the pool, it becomes that much harder, which is going to put a bigger burden on the town in terms of funding our retirement fund. I mean, I just don't see how this is going to benefit us.
Yep. No, it's a very good question. I think all those different avenues that you said about trying to tackle climate change are valid. I think the benefit would be there is inherent risk in that when that carbon budget gets reached, and the governmental, because they're going to have they have these yearly, right? The UN, they bring the countries together, but in Paris, I think is coming up in the fall, they're going to be talking about trying to address this issue of climate change, and when and if they do, so I think maybe it's not an if, but maybe a when is the question. When they do, what will happen to those fossil fuel companies that we relied on the income? There's an inherent risk behind that now those are unburnable and stranded assets. You might get, like if there's a real estate bubble and all the prices, house prices go down, you might get and that's just a question in the future. So
you say that, you make that statement and all your whereases here, but basically, again, I would rather leave it to the people that invest professionally to be able to see enough into the future. And as far as I'm concerned, you make a comment about it becoming an economic liability.
Yep.
If we stay funded in these. They should know when it's starting to become a problem and pull out at that time.
Yep. That's a fair statement.
I would rather leave it to them to decide that.
Ms. Vetter, I'm sorry.
Just to say, I mean, they're investing close to $1 billion at the state level, so I hope they know what they're doing better than we all do.
Yep, that's a fair statement, yeah.
Ms. Vetter.
Well, first, Mr. Moss, I'd like to thank you very much for bringing this. I think it's a conversation that's worth having. I also think it's good to see these type of petitions come from residents so that we can have a conversation about some of these things. I guess when I also am very concerned about global warming and, fossil. And so I think that, again, I think this conversation is good. I would agree that the people that do our investments are the experts in financial, but sometimes movements need to come by people, standing up and raising their hand and saying, we want to see the world go in a different way. So I think with that said, I'm glad we're having this conversation, but I think your third paragraph from the bottom where you talk about, you say you'd like to have the town review their investment portfolios in order to identify any holdings and investments and so forth. And that's kind of where I would have liked to have seen maybe this petition stop, to at least ask that there be a discovery, because I really don't know how much our portfolio is invested in these type of things and what type of financial impact that may or may not have on our investments. So on one hand, the town is really working to fund pensions and so forth, and I would hate to to pass this petition and really have that undermine a lot of that work. Yeah. However, I think that a petition that asks for this investigation and for us to talk to our investment people, because I don't think that we should just be blind as to what we're investing in. I think we should have some say in what we're investing in and understanding that impact so that we could then say, well, this is what some alternative investments could be. And I don't think it's a given that it would be a negative impact to us. Maybe there are other more creative places that we could be investing than in fossil fuels. So unfortunately, I can't support this petition the way it's written. As I said, I would have liked to have seen it written more to have a town meeting vote to have this type of analysis done to get a better idea of how much we have invested right now. But again, I want to thank you for bringing this, because if we don't start having these conversations and if we don't start moving in some other ways of investing, that's money speaks, and companies aren't going to start looking for alternative fuels until the pocketbook pinches. So those are my thoughts on
good.
this.
No, thank you for your feedback. No, I think transparency is important.
Mr. Budenhagen.
I'll just mention one comment on ExxonMobil. They spend more money on research of clean air and clean water than any company in the world. And if we would diversify ourselves from that and cut back on the use of fuel, where would that research money come from then? You don't have companies stepping forward like them. Even the BPs have spent, after their spill, they have spent millions and billions of dollars in clean air and clean water. So, it's hard to pick on that particular type of a company right at the present time as far as our investments go, because our investments right now are very low. The return on investment is very low over the last 4 or 5 years. And we need every one of those dollars to offset, the operation and expenses of this town.
Mr. Morgado, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I think everyone's comments very appropriate.
Thank you.
Again, this is Finance Committee, and fiduciary responsibility is to advocate for the highest possible returns possible, because those funds that aren't achieved through returns, as Mrs. Stillman mentioned, will either have to come from the taxpayer or from another department. Probably will not come from the taxpayer, but because this is a finite amount of money. So, and return goals aren't met, those funds have to come from some other location, but certainly the gentleman is well spoken. I don't disprove any of his arguments, but the end result is the reason why we have investments is to gain return.
Ms. Kane.
Thank you for bringing this forward. I think, as Judy indicated, it's always fruitful to have these discussions. But I do think that one of the things that can come out of this, because I can't support this the way it's written, but I think the notion of doubling down and making sure we're being as efficient as possible with our energy use is probably something that we can all agree is a very good thing to do as the town. But I think this takes us in a direction that I'm not comfortable with in terms of sort of mandating to the retirement board and further on up through the chain, which a lot of this we don't actually have direct control over. So I think at the end of the day, I can't vote to support this, but I do think that bringing forward a reminder that we all need to be as energy efficient as possible is a good thing. And I thank you for taking the time that you have tonight and in drafting this. And I would say in the future, and I don't know if you did this or not when you were drafting this, but sometimes it's always good to come in and talk to the town manager early on, too, to get a sense for what might be something within the realm of reasonableness versus what is a little bit overreaching in terms of where a town meeting might be comfortable going at the time. Not to say that town meeting might not do something different than we advocate for, but I think sometimes less is more in some of these things, and I think that this is probably just a little bit too aggressive in terms of some of the direction that it wants to take.
Okay. No, that's good feedback. Thank you.
Sure.
May we proceed? Oh,
I just want to make one more comment. I mean, again, this is all well and good, and I think, as Judy mentioned, getting it out in front of the public. But I mean, I have followed this as I gave you some examples of issues where clean energy has been shot down. I mean, I really believe, and maybe I'm talking not so much to you, but to everybody listening, is all of this begins at home. Like I said, not that I want to toot my own horn. We don't have air conditioning in our house. It gets hot every now and then in the summer, but, that's the way it goes. If everybody does something small, then eventually it'll add up. And they'll get the message faster that way, as far as I'm concerned.
Yep. No, you're right. Things start locally. It starts with your own home and works its way up from there. Yep.
but I love my navigator. We proceed to Article 14, please. Fluoride addition to the drinking water. Please proceed, Mr. Moss.
Okay. So, well, thank you for all that feedback. It was really good to hear all that. I was happy to be able to bring that one. And the next one is